The scar on his neck was barely visible under his collar, but Officer David Park had trained eyes. As a military intelligence officer, he noticed details others missed. The parking attendant who'd been working this downtown lot for over a decade moved differently than civilian workers. His posture, his scanning pattern, the way he positioned himself near potential cover. And when David got close enough to read the man's name tag, Torres, he saw something else that made him freeze. A tattoo on the man's wrist. Special Forces, the real deal. But what was a Green Beret doing collecting parking fees? Welcome to Veteran Stories. Before we continue this powerful story of hidden service, unexpected recognition, and the bonds that connect warriors across generations, tell me in the comments which city you're watching from today. And if you believe stories like these deserve to be told, hit that subscribe button and help us honor those who serve in silence. The Federal Building parking lot in downtown Seattle opened every morning at 6 a.m. sharp, and Michael Torres was always there 15 minutes early. At 52, he moved with the quiet efficiency of a man who'd learned that being early meant being prepared, and being prepared meant staying alive. The lot serviced 3 government buildings, the federal courthouse, the IRS office, and a nondescript building that housed various intelligence agencies. Torres had been working this particular lot for 15 years, ever since he'd needed a job that didn't ask too many questions about his past or require extensive background checks that might raise uncomfortable questions. He wore the standard uniform, orange safety vest, khaki pants, black polo shirt with downtown parking services embroidered on the chest. His name tag simply read, Torres M. No rank, no indication of anything beyond a man who collected parking fees and issued tickets to overtime violations. But Michael Torres moved like a soldier. He scanned his environment constantly, positioned himself with clear sight lines to all entrances, and kept his back to solid cover whenever possible. Most people didn't notice these habits. They were too busy rushing to meetings, talking on phones, or thinking about their day ahead. Most people weren't trained to notice. Officer David Park was different. David Park worked military intelligence at Joint Base Lewis McChord, about an hour south of Seattle. He came to the federal building twice a month for briefings with other agencies, and he always parked in Torres's lot because it was the closest to the intelligence office entrance. As an MI officer, David's job was reading people, situations, and environments. He noticed patterns, anomalies, things that didn't fit. And from his first visit to this parking lot, something about the attendant had caught his attention. Torres moved too well. His situational awareness was too sharp. His positioning was too tactical. These weren't conscious behaviors. They were ingrained reflexes that came from training and experience most civilians never received. David had been observing Torres for 6 months, always professionally, never intrusively. Just the kind of passive intelligence gathering that became second nature when you worked in his field. He'd noted the way Torres checked vehicles, not just for permits, but for anomalies. The way he interacted with obviously military personnel versus civilians. The way he carried himself when he thought no one was watching. Today was different, though. Today, David was going to find out who Michael Torres really was. David parked his Jeep in the usual spot and walked toward the attendant booth. Torres was updating his logbook, recording the morning's arrivals with the kind of precise handwriting that suggested military documentation training. "Morning," David said, approaching the booth window. "Morning, Officer Park," Torres replied without looking up. "Usual spot." David paused. Torres knew his name, knew his routine, knew he was military despite David never mentioning it. That level of observation and memory wasn't typical for a parking attendant. "You know I'm military," David said. It wasn't a question. Torres looked up for the first time, meeting David's eyes directly. "I know a lot of things. Part of the job." What kind of job requires that level of situational awareness? Torres set down his pen and leaned back slightly. David could see him evaluating, deciding how much to reveal. The calculation was subtle but unmistakable, the kind of assessment operators made when determining if someone was friendly, neutral, or potential threat. "The kind where not paying attention gets people hurt," Torres said finally. David stepped closer to the booth window, and that's when he saw it clearly for the first time. Torres was wearing short sleeves due to the unusually warm October morning, and on his left wrist was a tattoo that made David's breath catch: Special Forces tab. Not some civilian approximation or wannabe ink, this was the real deal. The font, the proportions, the style, all indicated it was genuine military tattoo work, the kind soldiers got to commemorate earning one of the most difficult qualifications in the U.S. Army. But there was more. Below the Special Forces tab was a unit designation that made David's training kick into overdrive: 5th Special Forces Group, Airborne. And below that, barely visible, were small symbols that David recognized as deployment markers for Iraq and Afghanistan. "Holy shit," David whispered, then immediately apologized. "Sorry, sir. Torres followed David's gaze to his own wrist, realized what had been exposed, and calmly rolled his sleeve down. "Just old ink. Doesn't mean much anymore." "Like hell it doesn't," David said, his voice filled with sudden respect. "5th Group? How many deployments?" Torres was quiet for a long moment, studying David's face. He saw the intelligence officer insignia on David's uniform, the serious expression, the way David had shifted his posture to something more respectful. "Enough," Torres said simply. David looked around the parking lot. Federal employees walking to their offices, contractors heading to meetings, the normal flow of government work. None of them had any idea they were walking past a man who had likely conducted operations they'd never hear about in places they couldn't pronounce. "Sir, what are you doing here?" David asked, gesturing to the parking lot, the booth, the orange safety vest. "Working," Torres replied. "You know what I mean." Torres was quiet again, longer this time. David waited, recognizing the internal debate of a man deciding whether to trust someone with information he'd kept private for years. "When you get out," Torres said finally, "sometimes the world doesn't know what to do with you, and sometimes you don't know what to do with the world." David understood. He'd seen it before. Elite operators struggling with civilian transition, finding that their skills didn't translate easily to normal jobs, that their experiences created a gap between them and people who'd never served. "How long since you got out?" David asked. 2009. Last deployment ended, came home and realized I didn't fit anywhere anymore." Over the next 20 minutes, as the morning rush subsided and the lot quieted down, Torres shared pieces of his story. Not operational details, he was too professional for that, but the broader outline of a career that had taken him to some of the most dangerous places on Earth. "Started as regular infantry in '88, Torres said. "Did Gulf War as an 18-year-old kid who thought he knew everything. Came home and realized I knew nothing." "That's when you went Special Forces?" "Took me 3 tries to get through selection. Finally made it in '94. Then it was just deployment after deployment. Somalia, Bosnia, Iraq, Afghanistan. Different missions, same story. Go where regular troops can't go, do what regular troops can't do, and never talk about it afterward." David listened with the respect due to someone who'd served at that level. Special Forces weren't just elite soldiers. They were problem solvers sent to handle situations that didn't have textbook solutions. "What was your specialty?" "Weapons and demolitions, but in SF you do whatever the mission requires. I've been a medic, a communications specialist, a language instructor, a liaison officer." Torres paused. "Hell, I've been a parking lot attendant." "So why here?" David asked, gesturing around the lot. "With your background, you could do private security, consulting, training." Torres leaned back in his chair, looking out at the city skyline visible beyond the federal buildings. "You ever been in combat, Officer Park?" "Some joint operations in Afghanistan. Nothing like what you probably saw." "Then you know that after a while, you get tired of the noise, tired of the stress, the hypervigilance, the constant awareness that everything could go wrong at any moment." Torres gestured to the quiet parking lot. "This is peaceful, predictable. No one's shooting at me, no one's trying to blow things up, and my biggest decision is whether someone deserves a parking ticket." David began to understand. Torres wasn't hiding from his past. He was seeking the opposite of it. After decades of high-stakes operations, he'd found peace in routine, normalcy, and the kind of quiet service that didn't require carrying weapons or making life-and-death decisions. But you still move like an operator, David observed. Torres smiled for the first time in their conversation. Some things you never unlearn. Situational awareness keeps you alive for 20 years. You don't just turn it off because you're checking parking meters. Is that why you knew I was military? That. And the fact that you've been observing me for 6 months, Torres said with amusement. Did you think I wouldn't notice an intelligence officer conducting surveillance? David felt his face redden. I wasn't conducting surveillance. I was just being professional. I know. I've been doing the same thing with everyone who parks here. Old habits. Torres opened a small notebook and showed David pages of observations, license plates, patterns of behavior, people who seemed out of place or potentially problematic. He'd been running his own informal security operation from the parking booth, keeping an eye on the federal buildings he served. Jesus, David muttered. You've been providing overwatch for 3 government buildings, and nobody knows it. Nobody needs to know it. I'm not looking for recognition or responsibility. I'm just making sure nothing bad happens on my watch. David stepped back from the booth window, processing what he'd learned. This wasn't just a veteran working a civilian job. This was a highly trained special operations soldier who'd found a way to continue serving, even if no one realized it. Sir, David said, his voice formal now, I need to ask you something. Torres waited. Would you be willing to talk to some people? Not about classified operations, David added quickly, but about transition, about finding purpose after service. We have a lot of young soldiers coming back from deployment who are struggling with the same things you went through. Torres considered this carefully. What kind of talking? Informal mentoring, maybe a monthly meeting with soldiers transitioning out of active duty, just sharing experience, letting them know they're not alone in feeling disconnected. I'm not a counselor, Officer Park. No, sir, you're better. You're someone who's been where they are and found a way through it. Torres was quiet for several minutes, watching the normal flow of people through his parking lot. Federal employees, contractors, visitors, all of them going about their daily routines without thinking about the men and women who'd served to protect those routines. I'd need to be careful about what I share, he said finally. Of course, sir. And it would have to be off the books. No official programs, no paperwork, no recognition ceremonies. Understood. Torres looked at David directly. Why does this matter to you? David thought about how to answer honestly. Because 6 months ago, I was wondering if I wanted to stay in the military or get out. Watching how you found a way to serve in civilian life, it's given me perspective on what's possible after the uniform comes off. And now? Now I think I understand that service doesn't end when you leave the military. It just changes form. 3 weeks later, David returned to the parking lot after hours. Torres was there, having agreed to meet with 5 soldiers who were within months of leaving active duty. They gathered in the small break room behind the parking office. Nothing official, just folding chairs in a circle and coffee in paper cups. Torres didn't lecture. He didn't give presentations or hand out advice sheets. He just talked about his own experience, the difficulty of translating military skills to civilian jobs, the challenge of finding purpose without clear missions, the isolation that comes from having experiences most people can't understand. The hardest part, Torres told them, isn't finding a job, it's finding meaning. In the military, everything you do matters. People's lives depend on your decisions. When you get out, it feels like nothing you do has that kind of importance anymore. A young sergeant named Williams raised his hand. So how did you deal with that? Torres gestured toward the parking lot visible through the window. I realized that service doesn't have to be dramatic to be meaningful. Keeping this lot secure, making sure people feel safe coming to work, maintaining order in a small corner of the world, that matters too. It's just quieter. Over the following months, Torres's informal mentoring sessions became a regular occurrence. Word spread quietly through veteran networks. There was a guy in Seattle who understood the transition, who'd been through it, and come out the other side with his purpose intact. The soldiers who attended these sessions began to see civilian work differently. They learned to find meaning and contribution rather than just excitement. Some went into private security, others into teaching, some into civil service. But all of them carried with them Torres's lesson that service is about impact, not recognition. David watched this transformation with growing respect for what Torres had accomplished. Without seeking attention or credit, he'd created a support network for transitioning veterans that was more effective than many official programs. "How many soldiers have you helped now?" David asked during one of their regular conversations. "I don't keep count," Torres replied. "That's not the point." "What is the point?" Torres looked out at the federal buildings he'd been watching over for 15 years. "The point is making sure they know they're not alone, that their service mattered, and that their value doesn't end when they take off the uniform." 6 months after their first conversation, David was promoted to major and transferred to a new assignment. Before leaving, he wanted to do something for Torres, some form of recognition for the quiet service he'd provided to both the parking lot and the veteran community. But when David approached his chain of command about recognizing Torres's contributions, he encountered a problem. Torres had been working under the radar for so long that there was no official record of his veteran status or his informal mentoring work. "Without documentation," David's supervisor explained, "we can't provide official recognition." David understood the bureaucratic limitation, but it frustrated him. Torres had been serving continuously for decades, first in uniform, then in civilian clothes. But because his recent service wasn't official, it couldn't be officially acknowledged. Instead, David decided on something more personal. On David's last day at the federal building, he approached Torres's booth with a small package. "What's this?" Torres asked, accepting the wrapped box. "Just something from the soldiers you've helped," David said. Inside was a challenge coin, not official military issue, but something David had commissioned from a local craftsman. One side bore the Special Forces crest, the other had a simple inscription: "Silent Service, Parking Lot Alpha, 2009 to 2024. Torres turned the coin over in his hands, studying the inscription. "Parking Lot Alpha. That's what we started calling this place. Alpha, as in first priority, because keeping this place secure is your first priority every day." Torres looked up at David with an expression of surprise and gratitude. "You didn't need to do this." "Yes, sir, I did. Because what you're doing here matters. And even if it's not officially recognized, it's recognized by the people who count." Torres continued working the parking lot, but something had changed. The challenge coin lived in his booth, visible to anyone who looked closely. More importantly, the recognition from David had reminded him that his service was valued, even if it was quiet. Young veterans continued to find their way to his monthly sessions. Some came through word of mouth, others through informal referrals from VA counselors who'd heard about the meetings. Torres never advertised, never sought publicity, but his reputation grew among people who understood the value of practical wisdom over official programs. One evening, as Torres was closing up the booth, a young woman in Army uniform approached. She was nervous, uncertain, clearly struggling with something. "Are you the guy who talks to soldiers about getting out?" she asked. "I'm a guy who talks to soldiers," Torres corrected gently. "What's on your mind?" She explained that she was 2 months from the end of her enlistment, scared about civilian life, worried that her military experience wouldn't translate to meaningful work. Torres listened without judgment, then asked a simple question. "What kind of work makes you feel like you're contributing something important?" As they talked, Torres realized that this was his real mission. Not the parking lot, not the security observation, not even the informal mentoring sessions. His mission was being available when someone needed to know that their service mattered and that their future had purpose. 2 years later, David returned to Seattle for a conference. He made sure to park in Torres's lot, curious to see how things had evolved. Torres was still there, still in his booth, still wearing the orange safety vest. But David noticed changes. There was a small wooden plaque next to the booth. "Veteran support resources available. Ask for information." And the booth itself had been upgraded. More comfortable seating, a coffee pot, space for small group discussions. "The building managers found out about your meetings," David said after greeting Torres. "They did. Turns out the federal building administrator is a Navy vet. When he learned what I was doing, he made it official. Gave me a budget for coffee and donuts, upgraded the space, even created a part-time counselor position." David smiled. "So now you're officially helping veterans transition." Now I'm officially doing what I was already doing. Same mission, more resources. Torres handed David a business card. Simple design, government formatting. Michael Torres, Veteran Transition Specialist, Federal Building Services. Still collecting parking fees? David asked. Torres laughed. Still keeping an eye on the lot, but now I also help soldiers figure out what comes next. Turns out both jobs involve helping people find where they belong. Michael Torres never stopped serving. When he left Special Forces in 2009, he didn't retire from service. He just changed uniforms. The orange safety vest became his new camouflage, the parking booth became his new observation post, and helping veterans transition became his new mission. For 15 years, he provided security for 3 federal buildings without anyone asking him to. He mentored dozens of transitioning veterans without seeking recognition. He found meaning in quiet service when the world assumed he was just collecting parking fees. David Park recognized Torres not because of his tattoo, but because of how he moved, how he observed, how he carried himself with the bearing of someone who'd served at the highest levels. The tattoo just confirmed what David's trained eyes had already detected, that sometimes the most valuable service happens in silence. Torres taught everyone he encountered that heroism doesn't always wear a uniform, that service doesn't end with discharge, and that the most important missions are often the ones no one knows about. So now I ask you, have you ever encountered someone like Michael Torres? Someone serving quietly, protecting others without recognition, carrying skills and stories they never talk about? Share their story in the comments. Tell us where you're watching from. Because at Veteran Stories, we believe that the greatest service often happens in the shadows, performed by people who never stopped answering the call to serve. Subscribe if stories like this matter to you. Because every community has protectors like Torres, and they deserve to be seen for who they really are.